Commander Rail Thorn had always thought Corespire was a name that screamed death trap, but then again, nobody asked his opinion when they named this rock. The planet was a grand tour of gray desolation, with the kind of architecture that screamed fascist chic, all sharp angles and imposing towers. It was a weaponized world, after all. "Looks like the decorators were on a budget," Lieutenant Mira Harker muttered beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon with the kind of distaste usually reserved for off-brand liquor. Rail smirked, his eyes narrowing against the harsh glare of Corespire's dying sun. "What do you expect, Harker? A splash of color, maybe some pastels to lighten the mood. A potted plant, at least." "Something to show they care," Harker replied dryly. They were here to oversee a peace treaty with the Xylaran Empire, a bunch of telepathic jellyfish with a knack for making humans feel exceptionally squishy. The treaty was supposed to put an end to a 2-decade-long war that had cost more lives than Rail cared to count. And yet, there was something about the whole setup that tickled his paranoia. He didn't trust treaties. Especially not with species that could read your thoughts and judge you for that time you accidentally called your 5th-grade teacher mom. "How long until they show?" Rail asked, adjusting the collar of his uniform as if that could somehow shield his brain from alien snooping. "Officially, 15 minutes. Unofficially, I bet they've been listening to us since we landed," Harker replied with a wry grin. "Good thing I didn't mention how last night's rations tasted like despair wrapped in cardboard," Rail muttered. Their team was small, a tactical group consisting of the kind of soldiers who had long since forgotten what home felt like. People like Sergeant Dax Mortensen, a mountain of muscle and gruff sarcasm, who now ambled over with the kind of slow, deliberate steps that suggested he was either taking his time or contemplating murder. "Boss, you ever get the feeling we're just pawns in some cosmic chess game?" Dax asked, scratching at his stubble like it owed him money. Rail chuckled. "If we are, I sincerely hope the player using us has some idea what they are doing." "That'd be a first," Harker added, her expression one of practiced cynicism. The air tasted of burnt metal and regret, a perfect complement to the Spartan grandeur of their surroundings. Corespire's skies churned with storm clouds, casting the landscape in a perpetual twilight that matched Rail's mood. A group of Xylarans emerged from the shadows of their looming spire, gliding over the ground like spectral shadows. Their gelatinous forms reflected the dim light in unsettling patterns, and Rail resisted the urge to fidget. Telepathic jellyfish or not, he wasn't about to show weakness. "Greetings, Commander Thorn," a voice echoed in his mind, unnervingly smooth and devoid of inflection. Rail inclined his head slightly, the gesture half respect, half muscle memory. "Ambassador Zix, always a pleasure to have my thoughts rummaged through without permission." Zix's form shimmered slightly, an indication Rail took to mean amusement, or maybe it was indigestion, who could tell with these things. "It is not rummaging if you leave the door open." Harker snorted softly beside him, earning a glance from Rail. "We trust the arrangements are to your satisfaction," Zix continued, drifting closer with an eerie grace. "Oh, absolutely," Rail replied, laying on the sarcasm thicker than a bureaucrat's report. "The ambience is unrivaled, really captures that abandon all hope vibe." Zix's tendrils flickered, and Rail could have sworn he detected a note of amusement. "The treaty is important, Commander. We must move beyond conflict." Rail's smile was a barbed wire fence around a graveyard of skepticism. "Funny, we were thinking the same thing, but then again, we tend to get suspicious when our enemies start agreeing with us." There was a pause, a heavy silence that even the telepath seemed to respect. "Rest assured, Commander Thorn," Zix said, its voice cool as the surface of a forgotten moon, "the treaty is in our mutual interests." "Mutual interests," Rail repeated, more to himself than anyone else. "That's what every bad deal starts with." The Xylarans drifted back a fraction, their forms losing the sharpness of their edges, blurring into the gloom. Maybe they were hesitating, maybe they were just bored. "Difficult to tell." "We'll hold you to that," Harker added, her expression a masterclass in feigned nonchalance. The Xylarans' departure was as silent as their arrival, leaving the humans alone amidst the foreboding architecture and their own creeping doubts. "You believe them?" Dax asked, once the last of the jellyfish had vanished into the shadows. "Do I believe a species that can read my mind but still can't grasp the concept of personal space?" Rail shook his head. "Let's just say I wouldn't bet my last credit on it." Harker crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if daring it to spit out another surprise. "So, what now?" Rail took a deep breath, the air flavored with suspicion and an aftertaste of diesel. "Now we find out what they're really up to." They retreated to their makeshift base, a slab of concrete pretending to be a command center. The inside was about as welcoming as a morgue, and the flickering lights only added to the charm. "Feels like home," Dax grumbled, kicking at a chair that had clearly seen better days. "If your home's a penal colony," Harker shot back, dropping into a seat with a sigh. Rail paced, considering the possibilities like a chef with a particularly rancid piece of meat. "The Xylarans want peace, but why now? After 20 years of trying to vaporize each other, why the sudden change of heart?" "Maybe they've realized we're just too damn lovable," Dax suggested with a grin that could curdle milk. "Or maybe," Harker said, her tone sharpening like a blade, "they're planning something worse." Rail nodded, his gut twisting with the kind of intuition that had saved his skin more times than he cared to count. "Exactly. We need to find out what that is before we're neck-deep in it. But how to investigate a species that could pluck secrets from your mind like fruit from a tree?" It wasn't like they could just waltz in and ask politely. "We'll need a distraction," Harker mused, her fingers drumming against the table. Dax's grin widened. "Distractions are my specialty. Just say the word." Rail paused, considering his team, the swirling uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of telepathic scrutiny. "We're going to need more than just your usual brand of chaos, Dax." "Oh, I can do fancy chaos, boss," Dax replied, cracking his knuckles with a sound like distant gunfire. Harker smirked, shaking her head. "Let's just make sure it's the right kind of fancy. I've had enough surprises for one lifetime." With their tentative plan forming, they set about preparing for whatever hell their actions might unleash. Rail could only hope that, when the dust settled, they'd have something resembling answers, or at least fewer questions. As they worked, the oppressive atmosphere of Corespire seemed to tighten, a reminder that beneath the veneer of negotiations lay a potential maelstrom just waiting for the right nudge to explode. Rail couldn't shake the feeling that this treaty was more smoke and mirrors than bridge building. And if the Xylarans were hiding something, he'd be damned if he didn't find out what before they all ended up on the wrong side of history. "Here's to peace," Rail muttered, raising an imaginary glass, "and all the trouble it brings." As the team fell into a tense rhythm, preparing for the steps ahead, the unknown loomed over them like a storm gathering on the horizon. They were no strangers to danger, but this felt different, like a game where the rules were written in an alien language, and losing meant more than just death. But then again, what else was new? In the grand scheme of interstellar diplomacy, it seemed that danger and deception were par for the course. Rail allowed himself a moment of dark amusement at the thought. "Welcome to Corespire," he murmured to himself, "where peace might just kill us all." As Rail paced the dimly lit command room, the flickering lights cast shadows that danced like anxious conspirators. Harker was hunched over a console, picking through the incoming data like it was a particularly unappetizing meal. Dax, meanwhile, had decided the best use of his time was seeing how long he could balance his combat knife on his fingertip. The mood was, in a word, tense. "These telepathic jellyfish are playing us," Harker said, her voice flat as a day-old soda. Her eyes were glued to the screen, watching the data stream with the same enthusiasm she'd reserved for a root canal. "I'm picking up telepathic disruptions, little pings on the radar. It's subtle, but it's there." Rail stopped his pacing, eyebrow arched like a cat contemplating a particularly stupid bird. "Subtle, That's not a word I'd associate with jellyfish trying to unravel our brains. Maybe they're learning subtlety, Dax offered, which was rich considering the man had all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. Or maybe they're just bored. Or, Harker interjected, fingers dancing over the keyboard, they're planning something that requires poking around in our heads first. Rail folded his arms, the weight of suspicion settling into his bones like a second skin. They could be testing for weaknesses, seeing how far they can push before we push back. And here I thought we'd get to enjoy our ceasefire in peace, Dax sighed, giving up on his knife trick and sheathing it with a flourish. Just when I was getting used to the idea of not dying in a fiery explosion. Harker smirked without taking her eyes off the screen. Don't get too comfortable, Dax. I don't think these Xylarans are the retiring type. The room fell into a contemplative silence, punctuated only by the hum of the equipment and the occasional crackle of static. Rail could almost feel the gears turning in each of their minds, the mental gymnastics required to predict the unpredictable. Let's say they're planning something, Rail began, voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. What are our options? Options? Harker looked up, brow furrowed. We could try to counter their telepathic signals, maybe some jamming tech if we can rig it in time. Or, Dax suggested with a grin that was all teeth and no warmth, we could just punch a few of them and see what happens. Rail snorted, shaking his head. Besides the fact that punching a jellyfish sounds like a terrible idea, we need to be smarter than they expect us to be. We're military, not scientists, Harker said, a note of frustration creeping into her voice. And even if we were, blocking a species that communicates telepathically isn't exactly in the handbook. Rail let out a long breath, his mind a hurricane of thoughts and half-formed plans. We need more information, something to give us an edge. Harker tapped a few keys, bringing up a map of Corespire's architecture, which resembled nothing so much as an unfinished game of Tetris. We could try and scout some of their tech. There might be something useful in their systems, provided we can get close enough without them reading our intentions. Stealing jellyfish tech. Sounds like a plan with no downsides at all, Dax said, sarcasm dripping off every word. But I'm game if you are. Rail nodded, his expression settling into that familiar mask of determination. We're already in over our heads. Might as well keep swimming until we find shore. With a plan, or at least the skeleton of one, they set to work, an uneasy alliance of distrust and necessity. Rail could feel the tension building like static in the air, a charge waiting for release. Their makeshift command center was a flurry of subdued activity, each member of the team lost in their tasks. Harker was pulling up schematics, her eyes sharp and focused, a predator on the hunt. Dax was busy assembling gear, his movements economical and precise despite the situation's absurdity. Always wanted to play spy, Dax remarked, slinging a bag over his shoulder with a casual grace that belied the potential for chaos. Just hope my application to secret agent school doesn't get lost in the mail. Just remember, Rail said, a wry smile tugging at his lips, subtlety. Oh, I've got a subtlety setting. It's just broken, Dax replied with a grin, the sort that usually preceded explosions, metaphorical or otherwise. Finally, the time came to move. The atmosphere outside was a blanket of oppressive silence, the wind carrying the scent of ozone and something else, perhaps the distant echo of conflict. They moved quickly, shadows among shadows, navigating the monolithic structures with the practiced ease of soldiers who'd long since learned to ignore the gnawing pangs of fear. As they approached the Xylaran outpost, Rail couldn't help but marvel at the architecture, or lack thereof. It was all alien angles and curves, a nightmare of organic design that seemed to defy logic. Perfect for a species that communicated through brainwaves and passive-aggressive telepathy. Inside, the place was eerily quiet, each step echoing like a shout in a library. The air hummed with the kind of tension that made your skin itch, 1,000 invisible eyes following their every move. "Keep your thoughts nice and boring," Harker whispered, her voice barely a breath. We don't need them getting ideas. Any suggestions? I don't usually have a problem being boring, Dax quipped, eyes scanning their surroundings with the precision of a laser sight. Try thinking about paperwork, Harker replied, the glint of humor in her eyes a welcome spark in the gloom. Or maybe a tax audit. Dax grunted, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sneeze. Damn, Harker, you really know how to kill a mood. Rail ignored the banter, focusing instead on the mission. They needed access to the central hub, a pulsating mass of alien technology that looked more like a giant brain tumor than a computer. If they could just get in, find some kind of intel. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime, a melody that was both soothing and deeply unsettling. It echoed through the corridors, a siren call that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "What's that?" Dax asked, his voice low and wary. "The jellyfish equivalent of a doorbell," Harker guessed, her expression tight with concentration. Rail motioned for silence, creeping forward with the kind of caution that came from years of surviving situations just like this. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a Xylaran sentinel. Its form shimmered in the dim light, a mirage-given substance, and Rail's hand twitched towards his weapon on instinct. The sentinel paused, its gelatinous mass rippling with an expression Rail could only describe as curiosity. It was a moment suspended in time. And then the Xylaran moved forward, its thoughts brushing against Rail's mind like a whisper. "Intriguing," the voice said, echoing within his skull. Rail gritted his teeth, struggling to keep his mind blank. "Just a routine visit, thought we'd drop by." The Xylaran's form shifted, rippling with something like amusement. Humans always have such colorful explanations. Behind him, Dax's fingers twitched, itching to resolve the situation with less diplomacy and more fists. Harker was a picture of calm, though Rail could see the tension coiled beneath the surface. "We're looking for something," Rail said, the words slow and deliberate. "Something you might be hiding." The Xylaran considered this, its tendrils flickering with something like approval, or maybe it was indigestion again. Hard to tell. Humans are always looking for something. Answers, mostly. But sometimes the answers find you. A cryptic remark, and one Rail had no time to process before the Xylaran drifted aside, gesturing them forward. The invitation was clear and equally unsettling. Rail exchanged a glance with his team. They were in too deep to turn back now. With no other options, they moved on, hearts pounding in the kind of unity only shared by those staring down the barrel of potential disaster. The path led them deeper into the bowels of the structure, the air thick with the scent of alien tech and possibly misguided curiosity. Finally, they reached the central hub, a room pulsing with energy that set their teeth on edge. The equipment was a tangle of organic wires and bioluminescent screens, a corona of light that seemed far too alive. "There's our jackpot," Harker said, moving to the nearest terminal with the kind of urgency, one reserved for fire drills and late-night pizza orders. "What are we looking for?" Rail asked, keeping watch as Dax scanned the room for any more surprises. "Anything that tells us what they are planning," Harker replied, fingers flying over the controls with the kind of dexterity that came from years of typing angry emails. "Think they'll miss us poking around in their stuff?" Dax asked, a hint of mischief in his voice. "Only if we're unlucky," Rail said, though his gut suggested they'd never had much luck to begin with. "But let's not hang around long enough to find out." As Harker worked, Rail's mind was a storm of questions and uncertainties. The Xylarans claimed peace, yet their actions suggested otherwise. If they were planning something, it was up to him and his team to stop it, or at least slow it down long enough to figure out what the hell was going on. Harker's voice broke through his thoughts, low and urgent. "Got it. Some kind of data file. Looks important. Grab it and let's get out of here," Rail said, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Before they changed their minds about playing nice. With the data secured, they retreated the way they'd come, a tension in the air that made their skin tingle and their nerves sing. Rail knew they were playing a dangerous game, one with stakes higher than any they'd faced before. "Think they'll notice it's gone?" Dax asked, his voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Oh, they'll notice," Harker replied, her expression unreadable. "Question is, what will they do about it?" The answer to that question was one Rail would rather not test. But as they slipped back into the shadows, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just kicked a hornet's nest made of telepathic jellyfish, a situation that promised to be as unpleasant as it sounded. Back at their base, the tension was palpable, a living thing that curled around them like smoke. They gathered around the terminal, Harker plugging in the data with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Let's see what the jellyfish don't want us to know," she said, her voice carrying the promise of revelations and maybe a little hope. As the data unfolded before them, Rail felt a chill creep down his spine. Whatever the Xylarans were planning, it was big, and if they didn't act fast, it could mean the end of more than just a shaky truce. "Well," Dax said, breaking the silence with a grin that held no humor. "Guess we're in it now." Rail nodded, his gaze fixed on the screen. "In it deep, but at least now we know which way to swim." As the pieces began to fall into place, Rail realized they were standing on the edge of a precipice, the only way forward fraught with danger and uncertainty. But then again, what else was new? In a universe full of threats and betrayals, it was all part of the job. And as the shadows of Corespire loomed around them, Rail could only hope they'd survive long enough to see the other side. Rail stared at the data on the screen like it was an old enemy he'd rather avoid at a party. It wasn't just lines of alien hieroglyphics. It was a tapestry of doom, a step-by-step guide to how the Xylarans planned to ruin their already pretty miserable lives. "Well, that's ambitious," Rail muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. His voice dripped with the kind of sarcasm you couldn't buy in a store, not even a sketchy one on the edge of imperial space. "Ambitious is one way to put it," Harker said, leaning back in her chair and looking at the ceiling like she was hoping it might suddenly fall and put her out of her misery. "Suicidal on their part might be another. Or yours," Dax added, his grin about as cheerful as a death notice. Rail could almost hear the clock ticking in some abstract way, like the universe was tapping its foot, waiting to see if they'd figure this out before it came crashing down around them. "So, any bright ideas on how we counter a telepathic invasion without letting them know we're onto them?" Harker gestured vaguely at the console. "We could always try the old unplug it and plug it back in technique. Works for most tech." "Right," Rail said dryly, "because I'm sure they haven't thought of turning it off and on again." Dax tapped his combat knife against the table with a dull, rhythmic thud. "Could always just shoot the problem." "Sure, Dax, we'll just shoot the telepathic jellyfish. What could possibly go wrong?" Harker rolled her eyes. Rail took a deep breath, the kind that made him question all his life choices up to this point. "We need to think outside the box, preferably a box that doesn't get us all killed. Or worse," Dax said, leaning forward. "Captured and made into brainwashed jellyfish groupies," Harker sighed. "Well, if we can't stop them from poking around in our heads, we could at least try to make them regret it." "How so?" Rail asked, genuinely curious about how one makes a jellyfish regret anything. "Garbage thoughts," Harker replied, a smirk forming. "Distract them. Flood their senses with the most annoying, mundane crap we can think of. Like earworms but for brains." Dax chuckled, an unsettling sound that made Rail question his sanity. "So, like a mental barrage of really bad pop music, or tax codes," Harker added, her eyes glinting with mischief. Rail tapped his chin, considering the absurdity of it all. "So, our master plan is to annoy them into submission." Harker shrugged. "Got any better ideas?" Rail thought about it, but the universe wasn't exactly handing out second chances or convenient solutions today. "All right, let's put it to the test. We'll split up, throw them off and see if we can distract them long enough to figure out our next move." The team moved like a well-oiled machine, or a machine that had seen better days but was still chugging along out of sheer stubbornness. They spread out through the base, each one digging deep into the depths of their minds for the most banal, annoying thoughts possible. As Rael settled into position, he thought about the time his uncle had cornered him to talk about the intricacies of intergalactic stamp collecting. Dax focused on the catchy jingle of a commercial for a product nobody needed. Harker zeroed in on a loop of the most irritating classical piece she could think of, a Mozart sonata turned mental weapon. The effect was immediate. Rael felt the mental pressure begin to waver, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. It was like discovering that the monster under your bed was just a particularly ugly sock. "Seems to be working," Dax whispered over the comms, the grin in his voice unmistakable. "For now," Harker replied, "but we'll need something more permanent." Annoyance isn't exactly a long-term strategy, Rael had to agree. While they'd managed to buy themselves some breathing room, he knew it wouldn't last. The Xylarans were still out there, still plotting their invasion, and it was only a matter of time before they regrouped. "Let's regroup and see what else we can dig up," Rael said, already heading back to the main room. "We need a way to take this to them before they realize we're onto their game." They reconvened around the console, the atmosphere thick with the kind of tension that made you want to punch a wall or three. Rael looked at his team, saw the same determination mirrored in their eyes. They were in deep, but they weren't out yet. "Okay," he said, leaning over the display. "What do we know?" "We know the Xylarans are planning an invasion," Harker said, her hands flying over the keys as she pulled up the data. "They're using telepathic interference to keep us off balance." Dax crossed his arms, his expression more serious than Rael was used to. "So we need to disrupt their interference." "Hit them where it hurts, and how do you propose we do that?" Rael asked, doubtful but hopeful enough to listen at least. "By giving them a taste of their own medicine," Dax replied, an edge to his voice. "Fight telepathy with telepathy." Harker raised an eyebrow. "You suggesting we recruit some mind readers?" "Just one," Dax said, a rare seriousness in his voice. "I know a guy." Rael's skepticism went up another notch. "A guy? The fate of the universe is hanging in the balance, and you've got a guy?" Dax shrugged, unperturbed. "Everyone's got a guy, if you say so," Rael said, his tone somewhere between exasperation and resignation. "All right, contact your guy. But we need to keep this quiet. Last thing we need is the Xylarans catching wind." Harker took a deep breath. "I'll handle the encryption." "Make sure no one's listening in." Rael nodded, a plan forming in the murky recesses of his mind. "Good. And in the meantime, we keep up the distractions. If we can keep them off balance long enough, we might just pull this off." Dax tapped the side of his nose, a gesture that was either reassuring or deeply unsettling. "On it, boss." As they set to work, Rael allowed himself a moment to consider the absurdity of it all. They were going up against a race of telepathic jellyfish with nothing but human ingenuity, a questionable contact, and an arsenal of annoying thoughts. It was either the worst plan in the history of plans or just crazy enough to work. Hours passed in a blur of activity, the team working with a focus born of desperation and caffeine. Dax made contact with his mysterious guy, who turned out to be a former intelligence officer with a penchant for mind games and a flair for the dramatic. They arranged a meeting on neutral ground, the kind of place where no one asked questions and everyone minded their own business. Rael, Harker, and Dax arrived at the rendezvous point, a seedy cantina on the outskirts of the sector that smelled like spilled drinks and bad decisions. Their contact was already waiting, a wiry man with a twinkle in his eye and a scar that suggested he'd played one too many games of Sabak with the wrong crowd. He introduced himself as Corwin, though Rael suspected that was about as real as a politician's promise. "You're the brains behind this operation?" Corwin asked, his voice like gravel wrapped in silk. Rael shrugged. "We're the people trying to stop the universe from going to hell in a handbasket." "Close enough," Corwin chuckled, a sound that made Rael's skin crawl. "I like you. You've got fire. So, what's the plan?" Rael explained their situation, laying out the Xylaran invasion plan and their attempts to counter it. Corwin listened, nodding along like someone who'd been to the end of the world and back and had the postcards to prove it. Telepathy's a tricky business, Corwin said when Rail was finished, but it's not impossible. Just takes the right kind of mind, and you're that mind, Dax asked, his skepticism evident. Corwin tapped his temple. I'm the best chance you've got, but it's gonna cost you. Rail crossed his arms. We're not exactly swimming in credits here. What do you want? Corwin leaned back, his grin wider than it had any right to be. Nothing much. Just a favor, somewhere down the line. Rail should have known better than to deal with someone like Corwin, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Fine. You help us stop the Xylarans and you've got yourself a deal. Corwin clapped his hands, the sound echoing through the cantina like a gunshot. Then let's get to work. We'll have those jellyfish wishing they'd never left the ocean. Rail couldn't help but smile, a grim sort of satisfaction settling in his gut. They had a plan, a way to fight back. And maybe, just maybe, they'd come out of this in one piece. The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparation, Corwin coaching them on how to shield their minds and turn the Xylarans' own powers against them. It was a steep learning curve, but Rail's team was nothing if not adaptable. As they practiced, Rail couldn't help but think of the irony in all this. Here they were, a ragtag group of humans, going toe-to-tentacle with a race of telepathic jellyfish. It was laughable, really, the kind of story you'd tell in a bar and no one would believe. But it was their story, and win or lose, they were going to see it through to the end. The training was grueling, pushing them to the limits of their endurance. But slowly they began to see progress, small victories that hinted at the possibility of a larger one. Finally, as the artificial sun dipped below the horizon, Rail called a halt. They were as ready as they'd ever be, and it was time to put their plan into action. Tomorrow, Rail said, addressing his team, we take the fight to the Xylarans. We stop their invasion and we do it on our terms. Dax nodded, a rare seriousness in his eyes. Let's make them regret ever messing with us. Harker smiled, a fierce determination in her gaze. For humanity, Corwin raised his glass, a smirk playing on his lips. For the hell of it, Rail raised his own glass, a toast to their improbable alliance. For the future, as they clinked glasses, a sense of camaraderie settled over them, a shared understanding that whatever happened next, they would face it together. And as Rail looked out at the stars, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They had a long road ahead of them, but they'd made it this far. Maybe, just maybe, they'd make it to the end. The lights in the command room flickered again, like a disco ball with commitment issues. Rail stood hunched over the console, the machine humming like a drunken uncle trying to remember an old tune, while his mind churned over the details of their half-baked plan. The goal: use Corespire's weaponized core to disrupt the Xylaran telepathy. Easy, right? Well, it was the kind of easy that involved dismantling a nuclear warhead with a butter knife. All right, folks, Rail said, rubbing his temples. Let's break this down. We've got a ticking time bomb of a planet and a universe full of jellyfish who'd like nothing better than to squish us like bugs. Any volunteers for the fun part? Define fun, Dax said, leaning against a console like he owned the place. Because if it involves anything less than blowing something up, I'm out. Harker rolled her eyes, which seemed to be her favorite workout. How about blowing up the Xylarans' telepathic network? That tickle your fancy? Dax grinned, a wolfish gleam in his eye. Now we're talking. Corwin, their dubious ally with the even more dubious background, tapped his fingers rhythmically on the table. Let's not forget, if we screw this up, you'll be the toast at the Xylarans' victory party. And trust me, they like their toast crispy. Rail sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from years of experience with plans that were more duct tape than design. We need to get into Corespire's core, rig it to send out a pulse that disrupts their telepathic link. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft whirring of machinery and the collective thinking of everyone present. Rail could almost hear the gears turning in Harker's head. Getting to the core isn't the problem, Harker said after a moment. It's making sure we don't blow ourselves to kingdom come in the process. Corespire's systems are ancient and finicky, like trying to defuse a bomb while juggling flaming swords. Sounds like my kind of date, Dax quipped, receiving a look from Harker that could liquefy steel. Rail looked between them, the faintest smile threatening to creep onto his face. Good. Then you and Harker have a task. Get down there, rig the pulse, and try not to dismantle the planet in the process. Harker gave a mocking salute. On it, Commander. Dax cracked his knuckles. Let's hope those jellyfish can't read our minds from the afterlife. As they left to prepare, Rail turned to Corwin. You sure about this? I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Corwin shrugged, the motion slightly unsettling. Telepathy's a two-way street. If we hit him hard enough, they'll get confused. Gives us the edge we need. Rail nodded. And if it doesn't work, Plan B, Corwin replied, smirking, which is to run like hell and pray they are allergic to oxygen. Brilliant, Rail muttered, half to himself. I can't wait to see Plan C. Corwin's grin widened. Don't worry. Plan C involves less running but more screaming. Rail couldn't shake the feeling that Corwin enjoyed this a bit too much. But he was the best shot they had, and beggars couldn't be choosy, especially when staring down the tentacles of annihilation. As preparations continued, the murmur of whispered conversations filled the command room, punctuated by the occasional clatter of equipment falling to pieces. Because, of course, nothing ever went right the first time, or the second. While Harker and Dax worked their magic, or insanity, depending on who you asked, Rail kept an eye on the console, watching for any signs of increased Xylaran activity. And sure enough, the Imperial space was beginning to buzz with the kind of energy that meant someone on the other side had noticed the humans were up to something. Looks like the Xylarans are getting antsy, Rail noted, eyes scanning the data streaming in. They're mobilizing. Guess they don't like the idea of us crashing their psychic party. Corwin peered over Rail's shoulder. Guess not. Better hope your crew's as good as you think they are. Rail shot him a sideways glance. I don't think, Corwin, I know. And when Dax and Harker get the job done, I'll be sure to send you a thank you card. Corwin chuckled. I prefer cigars. The banter was a thin veil over the tension threading through the room. Everyone knew what was at stake, understood the razor's edge they were balancing on. But if Rail had learned anything in his years of service, it was that the best way to conquer fear was to mock it into submission. Iors slithered past, each one more nerve-wracking than the last. Rail watched the clock tick down, felt the pressure mounting like a storm ready to break. He imagined the Xylarans, their gelatinous forms quivering in anticipation of their victory. Commander, Harker's voice crackled over the comms, bringing Rail back to the present. We're in position, setting up the pulse now. Take it slow, Harker, Rail advised, though he knew it was like asking a bull to tiptoe through a china shop. We need this to work. Nice vote of confidence, Dax chimed in. But don't worry, if I blow something up, it'll be the right thing. Rail smiled despite himself. Just don't make me come down there to save your ass. You wish, Dax replied, and Rail could practically hear the grin in his voice. Minutes stretched like Iors, the silence in the command room heavy with anticipation. Rail watched the console, waiting for the signal, that spark of hope amidst the chaos. Then, like a dam finally breaking, the pulse hit. The console flared, a burst of light that made Rail's heart leap into his throat. Systems hummed with life or panic, depending on your perspective, and the room buzzed with activity as everyone scrambled to interpret the results. Commander, Harker's voice came through again, tinged with disbelief. I think it worked. The Xylaran fleet's patterns are erratic. They're confused. You hear that, Rail? Dax's voice was triumphant. We pulled it off. Those jellyfish are swimming blind. Rail let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Good work, both of you. Now get back up here before something else goes wrong. Because something always goes wrong, Rail thought. It was practically a rule of the universe, as immutable as gravity or the stupidity of bureaucracy. As the team regrouped, the atmosphere shifted. The tension was still there, but now it was laced with the sweet tang of possibility. They'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. Nice work, folks, Rail said as Dax and Harker returned, looking like they'd tangoed with a tornado and come out on top. Now, we just have to keep them on their toes and figure out our next move. Corwin leaned back, surveying the room with an amused expression. Seems like we've got our work cut out for us, but I have to admit I'm impressed. Didn't think you'd actually pull it off. Rael gave a grim smile. Neither did I, to be honest. But now we've got the Xylarans on the defensive. It's time to press the advantage. Any ideas? Harker asked, her voice carefully neutral but her eyes sparkling with that dangerous light of determination. Rael looked around at his team, the ragtag group that had somehow managed to turn insanity into strategy. We've got the upper hand. Let's keep them guessing, keep them off balance. We'll strike when they least expect it, hit them hard, and make sure they can't recover. And if we fail? Dax asked, though the challenge in his voice was evident. Rael shrugged. Then we'll go down swinging. But if I know anything, it's that we're not going down without a hell of a fight. The room was silent for a moment, the enormity of their task settling in. But then Dax laughed, a sound that was equal parts madness and brilliance. I like the way you think, Commander. Let's show those jellyfish what humans are made of. Harker nodded, her expression fierce. For all the marbles, Corwin raised his glass, a mocking salute to their imminent confrontation. To the craziest bunch of humans I've ever had the pleasure of scheming with, Rael chuckled, a sound that was more defiance than humor. And to the Xylarans, may their nightmares be filled with our names. As the team clinked glasses, a new resolve settled over them. They had a plan, a way forward. And while the odds were still stacked against them, they'd faced worse with less. In the quiet that followed, Rael gazed out at the stars, the vast expanse of space a reminder of just how small they were in the grand scheme of things. But small didn't mean powerless, not by a long shot. They'd made it this far against all odds. Maybe, just maybe, they'd go a little further. Maybe they'd even win. And if not, well, Rael was sure they'd go out with a bang big enough to make the universe remember them. After all, humanity had always been good at making a lasting impression. The universe had a funny way of reminding you just how small you really were. On Corespire, with its ominous fascist architecture looming like a bureaucrat's wet dream, Rael Thorne was feeling particularly tiny. Sure, they'd just thrown a psychic wrench into the Xylaran telepathic network, but victory in this galaxy was as fleeting as a politician's promise. Rael leaned against the console, rubbing the bridge of his nose. As much as he enjoyed playing cosmic chess with telepathic jellyfish, he knew the Xylarans weren't the type to take a slap on their gelatinous cheeks without a counterattack. Rael, Harker's voice broke through his thoughts, cool and dry as ever. You really think those mind-bending jellies are gonna sit back and sulk? Not a chance, Rael replied, his voice carrying that distinct flavor of grim amusement. The kind that came from knowing the universe loved kicking you when you were down. If anything, they're probably plotting something dreadful. A surprise attack, maybe. Harker raised an eyebrow, the universal sign for I told you so. Figures. Should we start preparing for the worst then? Dax, who'd been occupying himself by seeing how many push-ups he could do without vomiting, chimed in, worst. Hell, I thought this was the worst. Can't wait to see what's next on the menu. Probably something spicy, Rael noted, glancing at the data on the console. The Xylarans were stirring, like a nest of angry hornets. He felt the familiar weight of impending doom settling on his shoulders, heavy as a guilt trip from his mother. Corwin, ever the delightfully dubious character, sauntered over with the air of a man who had nothing left to lose. I hate to break up the party, but our friends out there are rallying. And judging by the chatter, they're bringing the whole picnic. Rael couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity. Oh good, I was worried they'd forget to send the invitation. The command room was alive with tension, everyone on edge, waiting for the hammer to drop. The main screen flickered with data, painting a picture Rael wished was just an illusion, but reality had a nasty habit of being, well, real. You know, Dax mused, cracking his knuckles for the umpteenth time, I always said I wanted to go out in a blaze of glory. Didn't quite picture it involving psychic jellyfish, but hey, life's full of surprises. That it is, Rael agreed, feeling a pang of something approaching fondness for his motley crew. Let's just hope we can give them a surprise of our own. As if on cue, alarms wailed, lights flashing with all the subtlety of a neon sign in the red light district. The Xylarans were making their move, and it looked like they'd brought enough firepower to make even the most optimistic person reconsider their life choices. Rail snapped into command mode, the kind of urgency that only came when your mortality was dangling by a thread. All right, everyone, this is it. We've got incoming, and it's not the friendly kind. Get to your stations, and let's show them why humans are the best at making the impossible merely improbable. Harker rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. Always the motivational speaker, Commander. I'll be sure to quote you in my memoirs. Just don't leave out the part where I saved your ass, Rail shot back, moving to his station with a determination born from sheer bloody-mindedness. The team scrambled, each person knowing exactly what was at stake. The Xylaran fleet was closing in, a dark tide against the stars, threatening to swallow them whole. But if humanity was anything, it was stubborn. "Weapons ready," Dax reported, his fingers dancing over the controls with a kind of reckless enthusiasm that would make a kamikaze pilot proud. "Let's give these jellies a warm welcome." Corwin, ever the opportunist, had slipped into a seat near the communications panel. "I'll see if I can't feed them some misinformation. Maybe convince them they've got a leak in their psychic plumbing." Rail nodded, appreciating the gallows humor. "Just make sure you don't send them the blueprints to our own destruction." The room was a flurry of controlled chaos, the kind of organized bedlam that made you appreciate the little things, like not being dead. Rail's mind raced, trying to anticipate the Xylarans' moves, but the truth was, they were in uncharted territory. The first shots fired, and space lit up with the kind of light show that would put any New Year's celebration to shame. Explosions bloomed, a deadly ballet of fire and debris, as the human fleet fought to hold back the tide. "Commander, they're pushing hard on our left flank," Harker reported, her voice steady despite the madness. "We're taking heavy fire. Divert power to the shields," Rail ordered, feeling the weight of every decision as if it were a physical thing. "And prepare to counterattack. We've been through worse." The words felt hollow even to him, but what else was there to say? The Xylarans were relentless, their assault a testament to their desperation and perhaps a little bit of spite. The humans were holding their own, but Rail knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks started to show. As the battle raged on, Rail couldn't help but feel a deep, gnawing worry settle in his gut. They were outnumbered and outgunned, the odds stacked against them like a cosmic joke. But then hadn't it always been like this? Humanity, fighting against the odds, surviving by the skin of their teeth. "Rail," Corwin's voice broke through the chaos, a lifeline amidst the storm. "I've managed to jam some of their communications. It won't last long, but it might buy us a few precious minutes." "Good work," Rail replied, clutching at anything that resembled hope. "Let's make those minutes count." The fight continued, brutal and unyielding, each second stretching like eternity wrapped in barbed wire. The team moved like a well-oiled machine, each person playing their part in the symphony of survival. And though the future looked bleak, there was something undeniably human about their refusal to give up. "Commander, we've got a breach on Deck 3, Harker reported, her tone laced with urgency. "It's bad. Send a team to contain it," Rail ordered, his mind juggling 1,000 tasks, each one critical and unforgiving. "And Harker, keep me updated. We can't afford any surprises." Dax's voice cut through, a beacon of reckless optimism. "Surprises? I love surprises. Just not the kind that involve explosive decompression." "Noted," Rail replied, unable to suppress a smirk despite the gravity of their situation. The battle waged on, each passing moment a reminder of their mortality. Rail watched the console, eyes darting over the data, searching for any sign of weakness in the Xylaran assault. But they were a tenacious foe, their resolve as alien as their appearance. "Rail, I think I've got something," Harker said, her voice cutting through the noise. "The Xylaran's right flank is vulnerable. If we hit them hard, we might be able to turn this around." Rail considered the information, weighing risks and rewards. It was a gamble, a shot in the dark, but what did they have to lose? All right, let's go for it. Dax prepared a fire on my mark. With pleasure, Dax grinned, his fingers hovering eagerly over the controls. Rail took a breath, the kind meant to steel nerves and ignite courage. All units prepare to engage. We're going to show these jellyfish what it means to fight with your back against the wall. The command was given, and in that moment, Rail felt the collective will of his team rally. They launched their assault, a ferocious counterattack that spoke of desperation and defiance. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed to work. The Xylaran's flank wavered, their formation disrupted as chaos rippled through their ranks. Hope, that fickle and treacherous thing, dared to raise its head. But the universe, ever the sadist, wasn't done with its cruel games. As the humans pressed their advantage, a new wave of Xylaran reinforcements arrived, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm. Of course, Harker muttered, her voice a dry whisper, because it was going too well. Rail felt the weight of it, the crushing reality of their situation. They were fighting, clawing for survival, but the odds were slipping through their fingers like sand. "Hold the line," Rail commanded, his voice a mixture of determination and grim acceptance. "We're not done yet." The battle raged on, a ceaseless tide of destruction and defiance. The universe watched, impassive and indifferent, as humanity's darkest hour unfolded on the stage of stars. But in that darkness there was light. The light of stubbornness, of courage, of the indomitable spirit that refused to bow. As the Xylarans closed in, Rail knew that no matter what happened, they wouldn't go quietly. And maybe, just maybe, they'd make enough noise to be remembered. Rail Thorn stood at the center of the command room, trying to massage away the stress-induced migraine that had taken up permanent residence in his skull. The relentless chaos outside mirrored the noise inside his head. But there wasn't time to worry about the throbbing pain. There was a war to win, or at the very least, a humiliating defeat to delay. "Look on the bright side," Rail said, mostly to himself. "At least they won't charge us for the extra fireworks." Lieutenant Mira Harker, ever the picture of cool detachment and dry wit, shot him a sidelong glance. "That's comforting." "I was worried we'd have to file for bankruptcy after this." Dax Mortensen, busying himself with weapons controls, managed to let out a snort. "I always thought dying would be cheaper. Guess I was wrong." In the midst of the gallows humor, the console buzzed with urgency, spitting out data faster than a politician's empty promises. Everything pointed to the Xylarans pressing their advantage, their telepathic jellyfish minds coordinating in a way that was infuriatingly efficient. "Rail, about that thing we talked about," Harker started, her voice cutting through the din. "The old research on human mental shielding. We might have something here." Rail blinked at her, trying to process her words through the haze of exhaustion. "You mean the thing that was dismissed as pseudoscience and wishful thinking?" "Yeah, that one," she replied, her lips curling into a smirk. "Turns out, desperation is a great motivator. We found some old tech and research files from the early war days, back when people thought tinfoil hats were a good idea." Dax leaned over, his interest piqued. "So you're saying there's a chance we can literally block them out? Like tell the jellies to sod off and leave our brains alone? It's more like a temporary band-aid for our brains," Harker explained, her tone laced with dry sarcasm. "But considering we're about to be turned into cosmic roadkill, I'd say it's worth a shot." "Great," Rail muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Just what I needed." "More hope in another tin hat theory." Corwin chimed in from his station, fingers dancing over the keys as he worked to keep the Xylaran communications snarled. "You know, I always said if things got bad enough, we'd have to slap some duct tape on our skulls and hope for the best." Rail sighed, but there was a hint of a grin threatening to break through. "All right, let's see what this mental band-aid can do. If it keeps the Xylarans out long enough for us to regroup, I'll personally wear the damned tinfoil hat." Harker handed him a small device, the thing looking like a cross between a headband and a medieval torture implement. Just strap this on and think happy thoughts. Rael placed the contraption on his head, feeling both ridiculous and oddly hopeful. Happy thoughts in a war zone. Piece of cake. Dax followed suit, strapping on his own device with a mischievous grin. I don't know about you, but my happy place involves a lot fewer jellyfish and a lot more beer. Focus, gentlemen, Harker chided, though her eyes twinkled with amusement. If this works, we might just have the edge we need. With the devices in place, Rael felt a peculiar sensation, like a gentle hum at the base of his skull. It wasn't unpleasant, and for the first time in a long while his thoughts felt strangely quiet. The incessant buzz of the Xylaran telepathic network subsided, leaving behind an eerie calm. Well, I'll be damned, Rael murmured, the realization settling over him like a revelation. It's working. Feels like someone finally turned off the annoying background music, Dax quipped, running a diagnostic on the weapon systems. Now we just need to find a way to play them our greatest hits. Rael nodded, the wheels in his mind turning with renewed vigor. Corwin, keep the jelly's comms disrupted. Let's use this break to hit them where it hurts. Dax, plot a course for their weakened flank. We'll give them a taste of human ingenuity. Thought you'd never ask, Dax replied, his hands flying over the controls with a mix of dexterity and reckless abandon. The command room shifted into high gear, a flurry of activity as the team worked with newfound purpose. Rael felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that only came when faced with impossible odds and a glimmer of hope. They weren't out of the woods yet, but at least they'd found a path. Harker, anything else in those files that might give us an edge? Rael asked, scanning the status reports for any sign of weakness in the Xylaran lines. Plenty of wild theories and half-baked ideas, she replied, scrolling through the ancient data. But one caught my eye, something about amplifying the mental shields, turning them offensive. Offensive how? Rael inquired, his curiosity piqued. Well, if we can turn their own telepathy against them, we might be able to sow chaos in their ranks, she explained. Sort of like broadcasting a really bad reality show directly into their brains. Dax grinned at the thought. Sounds like my kind of warfare. Let's make them regret ever listening in. Rael felt a strange sense of camaraderie amongst the madness. They were a ragtag bunch, held together by sheer stubbornness and dark humor, but damn it if they weren't determined to make a stand. Let's do it, he said, the plan forming with each heartbeat. Corwin, keep jamming their signals. Harker, see if you can boost the shield output. Dax, get ready to fire on my command. We're going to give them a show they won't forget. A shared look passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the stakes, the danger, and the slim chance of success. But it was enough. It had to be. As the cacophony of battle resumed, Rael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Xylarans might have the numbers and the tech, but humanity had a knack for pulling through when the chips were down. Commander, shields are stable and holding, Harker reported, her eyes glued to the console. We're ready for Phase 2. Good, Rael replied, the words carrying the weight of their shared hope. Prepare to fire. The command room reverberated with the energy of their combined efforts, a fragile yet formidable stand against the looming tide. As the Xylarans bore down on them, Rael felt the familiar mix of fear and determination, the heady cocktail of battle that kept him grounded. Fire, Rael commanded, the word a beacon in the storm. The weapons launched in a devastating barrage, aimed with precision and fueled by defiance. The Xylaran formation wavered, their ranks disrupted by the unexpected assault. It was a small victory, but in the grand scheme of things it felt monumental. Hell yeah, Dax whooped, his fists pumping the air. Take that, you damn jellyfish. Rael allowed himself a fleeting moment of triumph, savoring the sight of their enemies in disarray. But he knew better than to bask in it for too long. The battle was far from over, and there were more challenges ahead. Keep up the pressure, he ordered, determined to press their advantage. Push them back and don't give them a chance to regroup. The room was alive with intensity, each person focused on their task, their eyes alight with the fire of battle. It was a tenuous balance, this dance with death, but they moved with a grace born of desperation and resolve. As the minutes ticked by, the tide began to turn. Rail could see it in the data, the way the Xylaran formations faltered, their once cohesive assault fraying at the edges. "We're doing it," Harker said, a note of disbelief in her voice. "We're actually turning this around." "Don't jinx it," Rail cautioned, though he couldn't quite keep the pride from creeping into his tone. "We've got a long way to go before we can pop the champagne." Corwin, ever the pragmatist, glanced up from his console. "I'll settle for not getting blown to bits, but celebrations sound nice too." The team shared a brief, collective laugh, the kind that eased tension and reminded them of their humanity. It was a momentary reprieve, but one that fortified their spirits for the trials still to come. As the Xylarans struggled to regroup, Rail knew they had to act fast. The window of opportunity was narrow, and there was no telling when the enemy would adapt to their newfound defenses. "Let's keep moving," Rail urged, his voice cutting through the din like a lifeline. "We've got to push while we can." "Harker, any updates on that amplification theory?" She nodded, her fingers flying over the controls as she worked to extrapolate the data. "I think I've got something. We can boost the signal, but it's going to be risky. It'll take everything we've got." Rail considered the implications, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar friend. It was a gamble, but then, what choice did they have? "Do it," he said, resigning himself to the unknown. "We'll throw everything we've got at them and pray it sticks." With the command given, the team sprang into action, their movements fluid and precise. Each second counted, a precious commodity in the high-stakes game they were playing. The hum of the mental shields intensified, a low thrumming that resonated through the room. It was a sound that spoke of uncharted possibilities, of human ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. As the signal amplified, Rail felt a strange sensation, a tingling at the edge of his consciousness. It was as if their combined will was reaching out, touching the minds of their adversaries with an unexpected force. The effect was immediate, the Xylaran lines fracturing under the weight of their own telepathy. It was chaos, beautiful and terrifying, as the aliens struggled to comprehend the assault on their senses. Rail watched with a mix of awe and disbelief as the tide shifted once more, their enemies floundering in the wake of the unexpected offensive. It was a moment of vindication, of triumph in the unlikeliest of circumstances. "Commander, it's working," Harker reported, her voice tinged with excitement. "They're falling back. Keep pushing," Rail urged, his heart racing with the thrill of the battle. "We've got them on the ropes. Let's finish this." The team complied, their actions fueled by the heady mix of hope and determination. It was a dance of fire and fury, each movement a testament to their resolve in the face of insurmountable odds. As the Xylarans retreated, the command room erupted in a cheer, the sound a cathartic release of tension and relief. They had done it. Against all logic and reason, they had turned the tide. Rail allowed himself a rare smile, the kind that spoke of hard-won victories and the promise of more to come. They weren't out of the woods yet, but they had bought themselves time, a precious commodity in the endless war. Looking around at his team, Rail felt a surge of pride, the kind that came from knowing they had faced the impossible and lived to tell the tale. "Let's not get too comfortable," he reminded them, though the warmth in his tone belied his words. "We've still got a lot of work to do." With the battle temporarily won, they regrouped, their spirits buoyed by the success of their daring gambit. It was a victory, small and impermanent, but a victory nonetheless. And in the vast, uncaring expanse of the universe, that was more than enough. Rail Thorn rubbed his temples, the migraine pulsing in time with the distant booms of battle. The Xylarans were retreating, but like a bad rash, they'd probably be back. Still, for once, things were looking less like certain doom and more like probable doom, which was a marked improvement. "How you holding up, Commander?" Dax Mortenson's voice cut through the command room's static. "You look like you've been chewing glass." Rail grimaced. "I'm fine, Dax. Just a little reminder that leadership ain't all glory and free drinks." Dax smirked, his hands deftly adjusting the weapon's controls. "Well, if you need a break, I could always take over. I hear I'm a natural with authority." "Right," Rael muttered, "because what we need is more explosions and inappropriate jokes." Meanwhile, Lieutenant Mira Harker was focused on turning their mental shields into offensive weapons. Her fingers danced over the console like she was playing a very complicated, possibly lethal game of chess. "I've got the amplification ready," she announced, sounding like she just solved a particularly tricky crossword puzzle. "What are the chances this blows up in our faces?" Rael asked, only half joking. "Reasonably high," she replied with a straight face. "But given our track record, I'd say we're overdue for some luck." Corwin, the eternal skeptic, chimed in. "Hope isn't a strategy, Commander." "No, but it's what keeps us from crawling under the nearest rock," Rael retorted. "And you can shove that rock where the sun doesn't shine." The team chuckled, a moment of levity in the grim reality they were facing. In the distance, Corespire loomed, its fascist architecture a stark reminder of the stakes. They were running out of time to strike at the heart of the Xylaran command center. "All right, folks," Rael said, pulling everyone's focus back. "We've got a shot at their command center. It's the jellyfish equivalent of hurting their feelings and slapping their mamas. Dax, get us positioned." Dax nodded, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Consider them slapped, Commander." The engines hummed, vibrating underfoot as they maneuvered into position. Rael could almost taste the tension in the air, a heady mix of fear and excitement. If they could pull this off, they might just tip the scales in their favor. "Okay, Harker, let's give them a taste of their own medicine," Rael ordered, trying not to think about the consequences if this went wrong. Harker flicked a switch, and the command room filled with the sound of the mental shielding system ramping up. It was like listening to an orchestra of angry bees, all determined to leave a lasting impression on the Xylarans. "Here we go," she said, voice steady despite the weight of their gamble. Outside, the sky above Corespire crackled with energy, vivid streaks of light arcing toward the Xylaran command center. For a moment, it was as if the universe held its breath, waiting to see if their plan would actually work. Then the feedback loop hit, and the effect was immediate. On their screens, the Xylaran forces recoiled, their ranks splintering under the onslaught of their own telepathic powers turned back upon them. It was like watching a balloon deflate in slow motion, surreal and oddly satisfying. "Look at them scatter," Dax crowed, his voice full of awe and unrestrained glee. "Like a bunch of drunks kicked out of the bar at closing time." "Keep the pressure on," Rael commanded, adrenaline surging through his veins. "We've got them on the run. Let's give them something to remember us by." The team worked in unison, a symphony of chaos and determination. Each move was calculated, every action a step closer to dismantling the Xylaran command structure. It was exhilarating and terrifying, the epitome of riding the razor's edge. "Commander, they're falling back," Harker reported, her tone edging towards disbelief. "I think we've actually done it." Rael allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, the sweet taste of victory mingling with the ever-present tang of uncertainty. It was a rare thing in their line of work, and he intended to savor it, even if only for a moment. But as the Xylarans retreated, something niggled at the back of Rael's mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. The treaty. The whole reason they'd ended up in this mess. There was something wrong about it, something that didn't add up. "Corwin," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as he moved closer to the comms officer. "What do you know about the treaty?" Corwin hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. "Why bring that up now?" "Because I'm trying to figure out why a bunch of sentient jellyfish would bother with a peace treaty they clearly had no intention of honoring." Corwin sighed, resigned. "All right, but you're not going to like it. The treaty was a setup, Rael. A way to lure us in, get us to lower our defenses while they prepared their telepathic invasion." Rael's heart sank. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was a bitter pill to swallow. So they were just waiting for the right moment to strike. "More or less," Corwin admitted. Figured they could wipe us out with one big telepathic wave, make it nice and clean. Too bad for them, we like to play dirty, Dax interjected, his grin wolfish and unapologetic. We need to finish this, Rael declared, the weariness in his bones overtaken by the fire of newfound purpose. If the treaty was a trap, we need to turn the tables. And how do you plan to do that? Harker asked, arching an eyebrow. Rael smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that promised retribution. We hit their command center, hard. With renewed determination, the team set to work on their final objective. The Xylarans might have thought themselves clever with their false promises of peace, but they were about to learn a harsh lesson about underestimating humanity. As they approached the Xylaran command center, the tension in the command room grew palpable. Every move was critical, every decision laden with the weight of life and death. "Ready the main cannon," Rael ordered, his voice steady with resolve. "Let's make this shot count." The command room fell silent, the only sound the low hum of the weapon charging. It was a moment suspended in time, a crystallization of hope and desperation. "Fire!" Rael commanded, and the word cut through the silence like a knife. The cannon fired, a brilliant lance of energy that streaked toward the Xylaran command center with unerring precision. It was a sight to behold, raw power unleashed with deadly intent. The impact was cataclysmic, a shockwave that reverberated across the battlefield and sent the few remaining Xylaran forces into disarray. It was a decisive blow, a fitting end to their audacious plan. "Hell of a shot," Dax said, his voice tinged with admiration. "Remind me not to get on your bad side, Commander." Rael allowed himself a brief moment of triumph, the reality of their victory beginning to sink in. They had done it. Against all odds, they had turned the tide and struck a blow for humanity. But even as the cheers erupted around him, Rael knew better than to let his guard down. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. "Good job, team," he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won respect. "But let's not get too comfortable. We've still got loose ends to tie up." As the team regrouped, Rael felt a sense of camaraderie and purpose that was rare in their line of work. They were a ragtag bunch, held together by grit and dark humor, but they had proven themselves in the crucible of battle. Looking around at his team, Rael felt a surge of pride. They had faced the impossible and emerged victorious, a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. "Let's wrap this up," he said, and the words were a promise of more battles to come, more challenges to face. But for now, they had earned a moment of reprieve, a fleeting but precious victory in the vast, uncaring universe. Corespire hung in orbit like a particularly grumpy old man, full of hot air and ready to blow at the slightest provocation. With the Xylaran threat temporarily squashed like the world's ugliest bug, the command room aboard Rael's ship was a flurry of activity. And sarcasm. Mostly sarcasm. "You know, every time I think the universe can't get any more messed up, it finds a way to surprise me," Rael grumbled, rubbing the persistent ache in his temples. It was the sort of ache that only came from dealing with intergalactic telepathic jellyfish. And seriously, who signed up for that? Dax Mortensen wiped sweat from his brow as he lounged against the weapons console, looking like he'd just come back from a particularly brutal gym session. "Look at it this way, Commander. We've single-handedly turned this rock into a symbol of human strength. And by strength, I mean stubborn, bloody-minded refusal to die," Rael snorted. "Great. We're the galaxy's most determined cockroach." Across the room, Lieutenant Mira Harker was busy with the console, her fingers a blur as she checked and double-checked the systems. She paused just long enough to offer a dry comment. "We're going to need a bigger spray bottle." Corwin, the skeptic of the group, raised an eyebrow. "You really think the Xylarans are gone for good?" "They seemed pretty keen on telepathically rearranging our brain cells. Gone." "No." Rael shrugged, his smile as sharp as a shard of broken glass. "Licking their wounds. Definitely. And for now, that's enough." The command room was a mess of tangled wires and flickering lights. It looked like the kind of place you'd expect to find a really enthusiastic techno DJ or a very confused octopus. Rail and his team had made a temporary home here, which meant they'd left behind the usual trail of half-empty coffee cups and discarded wrappers. It wasn't pretty, but it was theirs. As the adrenaline began to ebb, Rail took a moment to reflect on the cost of their victory. He'd lost count of how many sleepless nights he'd spent poring over battle plans, of how many good people had been lost along the way. The thought was a bitter pill, one that left a taste like old pennies in his mouth. "Commander," Dax called, breaking the silence with the subtlety of a crashed starship. "Any thoughts on what we do next? Besides, not getting blown to pieces." Rail sighed, letting his gaze drift toward the view of Corespire's surface below. "We consolidate. Patch up the ship, make sure there aren't any nasty surprises left behind by the Xylarans. We've got a bit of breathing room now, and I'd like to use it before the next crisis comes barreling in." Harker leaned back in her chair, a hint of a smirk playing on her lips. "Think we'll get a day off? Maybe a nice beach holiday." "Beach holiday," Rail snorted. "In this galaxy? You'd sooner find a Xylaran that moonlights as a hairdresser." Dax chuckled, his humor as dark as space itself. "Can you imagine? I thought I said a buzz cut." "Oh, sorry, I just telepathically sensed you wanted to be bald." Realizing their small victory was, at best, a speed bump in the grand scheme of things, Rail allowed himself a moment to consider what lay ahead. The universe was a fickle place, and while the Xylarans had been dealt a blow, there were always new threats waiting in the wings. Humanity had proven its resilience, but resilience alone wouldn't save them from the inevitable chaos yet to come. "Rail, we've identified potential weak spots in their network," Harker said, her voice bringing him back to the present. "We can hit them where it hurts next time they try something." "Music to my ears, Lieutenant. I'm counting on you to make sure our next encounter is as uncomfortable as possible for our jellyfish friends." Corwin, ever the voice of reason or pessimism depending on who you asked, leaned in. "And if they come back swinging," Rail met his gaze, a steely determination in his eyes. "We'll be ready. We might not have the fanciest technology or the biggest guns, but we've got grit. And if there's one thing we're good at, it's coming back from the brink." "That's nice and all," Dax said, flexing his muscles with a grin. "But I like to think it's my devilish good looks that keep us winning." "Right, because the Xylarans are clearly terrified of your biceps," Harker quipped, rolling her eyes. As the banter continued, Rail took a moment to appreciate the camaraderie that had developed among his ragtag team. They were an odd bunch, thrown together by necessity, and held together by shared experiences and a mutual understanding of just how screwed up things could get. Corespire had become more than just a battlefield. It was a symbol of their tenacity, their ability to adapt and overcome. And while it might not have been the most glamorous of victories, it was a victory nonetheless. "Let's get to work, people," Rail said, clapping his hands together with a decisive thud. "We've got a galaxy to protect, and I'm not about to let some overgrown seafood platter take it away from us." As the team dispersed to their various tasks, Rail took one last look at Corespire, its rugged surface a testament to the battles fought and the lives changed. The universe was still an uncertain place, full of shadows and threats lurking just beyond the horizon. But for now, they had won a small reprieve, and Rail intended to make the most of it. He allowed himself a brief smile, his thoughts a swirl of determination and grit. Whatever the universe threw at them next, they would face it together. Because if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was finding humor and strength in even the darkest of times. "Hey Rail," Dax called out as he headed for the exit next time, "how about we fight something a little less squishy?" Rail chuckled, shaking his head as he followed. "No promises, Dax, but hey, maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe the next threat will be allergic to sarcasm." With a final glance at their makeshift command room, Rail led his team out, ready to face whatever the universe had in store for them. Corespire might have been a temporary victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. a reminder of what they were fighting for and the strength they'd found in each other. As they walked through the corridors of their ship, the buzz of activity and the hum of machinery providing a familiar backdrop, Rael felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. Because in the end, it wasn't the weapons, the technology, or even the strategies that made the difference. It was the people. The snarky, irreverent, stubborn bunch of humans who refused to let the universe have the last laugh. And if there was one thing Rael knew for sure, it was that he wouldn't have it any other way.